something that I've learned so much in just my work as a photographer was we take photos of what is important to us or what feels impactful in that moment or something that feels beautiful or something that feels interesting. And so I really wanted to be able to remember how important these moments were and to just not forget that this was such a profound sense of time in my life that was filled with terror and rage and like sadness and all these other things, and also beauty. It's like that's the part that is so kind of difficult about grief, is that and losing someone, is that you see both like the ugliest sides of life and also the most profoundly beautiful. Like the ways that people show up for you are like mind-blowing, and then also the horrible devastation of the people who don't show up for you, and savoring these quiet simple moments. Or like there are a few little moments that I had with my mom at the end of her life that like I will cherish forever.
Hello, my grieving friends. I'm your host, Lisa Kefauver. Welcome back to another episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. Just in case you're new to the show, yes, this is a podcast all about grief. We explore the expansiveness and pervasiveness of grief in our daily lives. What I've learned over my 20 plus years as a social worker and the more than a decade I've spent now as a widow is that if we lean in and hold space and bear witness for one another in the most difficult seasons of our lives, well, that's where true connection, healing, and community building happens. Now, before I introduce today's fabulous guest, I wanted to remind you of something important about grief that I think our culture gets wrong. Recently, I had the honor of giving a talk called Centering Aliveness in a World Full of Loss at Endwell in Los Angeles. And one of the important reflections I offered is that to be with our grief does not require us to deny the everyday wonder or delight that might also appear in our lives. In fact, to build our capacity to welcome, hold, and metabolize both our individual and collective grief, we must be present to what animates us too. In fact, the musculature, the strength, and flexibility required to attend to our sorrow is the same that allows us to engage with hope, to feel connected, and to nurture our souls. So if you're feeling the deep overwhelm of grief, either because of national or world news, or from a more intimate source in your own life, remember to find ways to be, as I call it in my book, a joy detective too. Okay, on to today's guest. Jamie Thrower is a queer death doula, death educator, funeral celebrant, and community grief worker living in Portland, Oregon. Jamie focuses their work on LGBTQ plus advocacy in end-of-life and grief care, and is the founder of Queer Grief Club, an online support and resource space for LGBTQ plus grievers. Jamie is also a multimedia artist, weaving collage, lino-cut prints, watercolor, and photography into zines and art pieces on the topics of death, grief, and loss. In this episode, we explore the intersections of grief, art, and community. Jamie and their partner experienced pregnancy loss, and when they were seeking support, what they discovered is a lack of safe spaces for grieving individuals, particularly within the LGBTQ plus community. This led to the founding of the Queer Grief Club. Jamie has also survived the death of both of their parents, and they share the importance of creative expression in processing their grief. They invite us into their journey of using photography and art as tools for mindfulness and connection. I can't wait for you to meet Jamie. My grieving friends, I am so thrilled to be bringing you this human being today. We've had the chance to spend a little time together in person and to connect on our shared passions. So Jamie Thrower, welcome to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I can't wait to dive in with you today.
Thank you so much. I've been a long time longtime listener, and so grateful to be on the show today.
Amazing. Well, you all heard at the top of the show the vast and interesting experiences you've had. I think in particular, one of the things I want to draw out from you today are some of the intersections, particularly around art and community and grief and loss, because I don't think we've explored it a little bit on the show over the years, but I think that's particularly, I think, as of interesting to us and maybe helping us even understand those of us who do not consider ourselves artists. How do we use the creative endeavor to help us move us along this experience, these seasons that we're going to be facing? And of course, the intersections of how you're showing up in the queer community and community grief and death work. So lots of topics to cover and explore today that I'm really excited that I think you offer such a rich, unique perspective. But of course, I want to start our conversation where I start every single conversation on the podcast. And that's helping us start to understand where we learned our grief beliefs and start to interrogate whether or not they're serving us or not. So can you think of an early loss that you faced, could be death loss or another, and just tell us a little bit about it, how the adults in your life were modeling implicitly, explicitly grief, and what do you think that taught you? How did that shape the grief beliefs that you brought into your adulthood?
Yeah, I love this question. And I love this question because I do have such a visceral memory of my first experience with grief, which was in kindergarten. And we lost both of our dogs kind of very quickly in relationship to each other. And so I remember going to kindergarten and all I really wanted to do was staple pieces of paper together to make a book and to write and draw a book about my dogs and to kind of quietly cry while I did it, which I was like, now I think back and I'm like, yeah, that's still what I do, when I'm grieving. And I was sent home from kindergarten and I was told that maybe could come back when I was a little more adjusted or, and one of the things that was so kind of interesting about that was that it wasn't like I was having big emotional outbursts or breakdowns. I really just was kind of quietly processing and using art in this way. And so my mom was such a incredible nurturing person and she brought me home and we did a lot of ritual and things to think about our dogs, and we bought little stones for them in the garden. What that really kind of taught me was that grief shouldn't exist in public spaces, that you should go home and you should deal with it with your family. And then you come back when you've stopped crying. And I'm like, that literally kind of is the summary of what so many people's grief experiences are. It's deal with it at home, deal with it privately, don't inconvenience or make anybody else uncomfortable around you, even if you're not even asking for interaction with them. And then just come back when you're ready to go back to normal. This idea of just kind of sequestering yourself away and then coming back when you can participate in the same way that you were before the loss. And so I thought that was really interesting. And I have for such a long time felt very introspective in my grief. And I have kept it very kind of insular. And I do so many grief practices and things at home. And what has been really inspiring is to learn more about grief and to really be engaging in community grieving now and external grieving and bringing more people into my grief experience, which has been really profound and terrifying, but so beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, my friend, so many gems of wisdom there that I want to pursue.
Yeah.
That you shared. Yes, there were so many pieces that you brought up there that are I can see so clearly how they're the through line, both to the way in which, as you just shared, because I've gotten to know you and become your friend, the way you walk personally in the world, but also shaped the work that you do in community. I want to name, I think so many listeners were just nodding their heads voraciously while you were talking about what it may not have been kindergarten and it may not have been over their dogs, but it was some cue that they receive from the world that your grief expression, right? Because grief is sort of internal, but like your grieving that you do externally, the way you show up in the world, your mourning practices are too much for
Yes.
other people, right? It's
Yeah.
too much. And to just keep it in quiet and keep it inside, which is historically across time and space for humanity, not actually how grief and mourning were
Right.
practiced. And so we
Yeah.
have an innate, don't you think? We have an innate need to connect, but then we get these conflicting messages from the world that says,
Exactly.
and you were
Yeah.
5, so
Yeah. Yeah.
worse. Yeah.
Yeah. So it becomes such a confusing world because when you think about the ways in which grief comes out of us, we are really built for human connection around that. Like I even think about like when people are wailing, when people are, doing that extreme kind of expression of their grief, we are doing that so it can be heard by other people, so that we can like bring other people into our grief experience. I've even heard stories and studies about like the reason that tears are so visible, so other people can recognize them and we are able to, come together in community. And so when we have this like innate sense of like, I want to connect with other people in this grief, or I need support, but then we're given these conflicting messages of like, no, you go do that over there and then come back in, it really adds to that feeling of isolation, especially when we're already in this kind of liminal space of trying to figure out my life now. It's profoundly changed and nothing particularly makes sense. So I'm just really trying to kind of straddle these different lines, and everyone's giving me mixed messages. And now I feel really alone.
Yes, so profoundly important. It's why I do the work that I do. It's why I've had a sustained meditation on holding space and bearing witness for more than 2 decades, because I
Yes.
recognized early on how powerful it is and how necessary, to your point, it is, like down to our human neurobiology, to be
Yeah.
witnessed in these times of great tumult. Because to your point, whether it's a death loss or some other kind of loss, it is innately isolating in and of itself. We don't recognize the versions of ourselves that we are in the after. We maybe have lost a connection to a person or a place or a homeland, and then to be further othered by, the reactions, I think is so, so profound. And so I appreciate you naming that, and also, alluding to what we're going to talk about, which is the ways in which you've then intentionally made community death work and community work so central to what you're doing, which feels like such the antidote to what you just described. And I think, for so many of us in this space, I think that's what we end up doing. We end up seeking and creating that which we lost. As I shared at the top of the show for our listeners, identify as a queer death doula, death educator, funeral celebrant, a community grief worker, right? And so all of these sort of titles and modes and ways of doing this work. But I also know that you're an incredible artist, photographer, weaver. So do you want to just kind of I want to dive into what your work looks like now, but can you sort of start to weave the thread and story of sort of your creative life into this life and how that
Yeah,
unfolded?
absolutely. I mean, I grew up in such a creative family. My mom was an artist and she was brilliant. And so she was always really encouraging so much creative expression. And I just kind of fell in love with it. And one of the things that my mom did especially well was kind of mixed media collage. And I watched her even in her own grief process, because grief was also very present in our lives. And we, as a family, experienced a lot of loss, so a lot of grandparent loss really early on. But both of my parents also had really impactful grief experiences in their childhoods. And my mom especially lost a parent when she was 11. She was the oldest of 8 kids at the time. And so she really she talked a lot about how she didn't get to grieve.
Yeah.
And she didn't get to go to the funeral. And she didn't, it was really like they moved on in a way that was really difficult for her. And she didn't begin to even explore it until much later in life. And so when she got diagnosed with cancer, part of her cancer practice, or like kind of her healing practice in that, was doing art. And so she was taking collage classes, and she was taking watercolor classes, and she was creating these books that were so beautiful, processing kind of what she was going through. That always kind of reminded me that I had art as something to fall back on, to return to utilize as a tool in some way.
How
And
old were you when she was diagnosed? Can you remind us?
yeah, I was 10 years old
Okay.
when she was
Yeah.
diagnosed with cancer.
Okay.
And it was one of those things where they were kind of like, you have a 50-50 chance of surviving the next 5 years. And everything was just so up in the air. And then at the same
Ambiguous.
time, yeah. And then a few years later, my dad was diagnosed with a terminal illness. So there was always this kind of like air of nothing is guaranteed. We are working through a lot of this impermanence of life, and we're still bringing in creativity in this way. And so I was always straddling this line of, I want to be a helper. I also like love art, and I love creativity, and I love all of that. And so even in college, I was kind of like going between back and forth of, I'm doing art as my major, and now I'm doing public health, and then I'm kind of doing human sexuality studies, and then I'm taking this class. And so ended up kind of working my way into and fell into photography in this way, which was really, really beautiful and wonderful. And I used it as my creative outlet, as my career. But because my life was so filled with grief, it also was that channel in a way that I didn't necessarily know. So I started photographing my mom when she was sick, especially in her last few years of life. I was photographing people with a real sensitivity to that. And because I was talking about grief and death, some of my clients were then felt comfortable to say, my grandma is coming to our wedding and I don't know how much longer. So can you pay close attention to these things? And so I started feeling the ways that grief could really intersect, in the creative process, in paying attention, in like holding those details, in thinking about like, what are all of these memories and things that I want to preserve? So it's been a really beautiful kind of way of constantly flowing back between each one. And I've known that as my career shifted into death work, into grief work, I knew my creative side was never going to leave me. And it was always going to actually be something that I could bring to this work that would be really cool and profound and interesting in a way that could support people or could give someone a different option for how to move with their grief, especially for those people who feel sometimes like sitting in a support group isn't accessible to them, or that feels too intimidating. But do you want to come sit and do some collage with me, like outside on a farm, and you can talk about your loss, or you can not talk about your loss, and like we can just be there doing something tactile together. It's really special to see what kind of unfolds for people.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I want to dig deep into what are some of the ways in which you're using art in this various work. And in particular, are there, the communities that you serve and where the intersections there? And yet I want us to pause before we get into professional Jamie.
Yeah.
To think about the personal Jamie. So there you were having your mom model quite bravely and honestly, this is how I'm using art to cope with this, my own illness, my own uncertainty. Your dad was diagnosed with this terminal illness. So you were already using art. But when you look back, because remind me of the ages you were when at each passing or.
Yeah. So I was 21 when my dad died, and I was 28 when my mom died.
When your mom died.
Yeah.
So when you look back at that time, how do you think what was your art practices for yourself, not the ones your mom were doing, but for yourself? And what do you think it offered you different than maybe if you also, by the way, I don't know, went to a support group or talk therapy or something? Like,
Yeah.
what were the practices that you were using? And looking back now at your current age to the 28-year-old you and the 21-year-old you who was participating in those practices, What gifts do you think that offered you, or what did you learn from
Yeah,
experience?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think I used photography a lot, especially when my mom was dying, because it felt like one, the most accessible thing to me in that
Yeah.
moment. It's hard to sit and make space for yourself to like paint or to do something when, your world is kind of collapsing. But when you have a tool like a phone at your hands, I could take pictures of details and things and just kind of like locking in that moment of time. Like I have this photo and it's maybe from like 2 days after my mom died. And it's just this pile of, we called it the carb pile. It was like this pile of bread and carbs and things that people had dropped off. And we didn't really particularly know what to do with. And so it just became this growing pile of like bread on our counter. And it was just all these things that I kind of wanted to both remember, but that would jog my memory when more time had passed, or could help me process in a way, or just help me kind of express to other people what I was going through. So like maybe I can't fully explain what it's like to be in my shoes 2 days after my mom's died and it's Christmas time,
Yeah.
but I can show that like lonely, empty, big pile of like random different breads, and then the Christmas stuff behind, and there's like that kind of ache and that confusion and that loneliness and that like nothing makes sense. And so that really became such a way for me to express myself. And then as my grief changed and started to grow, then I was able to even pull things like old photographs like that and bring them in with new things, found articles of things or pictures, or starting to pull in all different kinds of stuff. And so when my mom was doing a lot of art, she was doing so many mixed media things. And I watched her take little pieces of buttons from like her dad's sweaters or old receipts or things that she found when she was going through old stuff of her parents. And so being able to really reuse those in a way to create something new was really beautiful. And so I've been able to take some of her stuff and do that too, and start to collage. And so it feels like this way of giving new life to things, but also like, especially with collage, you're really rearranging something that doesn't necessarily make sense at first. And you're kind of putting together all these pieces. And that to me feels like such an expression for grief, and such a way to kind of like get somatically into this practice of how can I rearrange some things, and like what is that doing in my mind to think like, okay, this piece of paper has been ripped into a million pieces, and how can still take some of those pieces and rework it to make something beautiful, or to make something that resembles me in my new life now. So it's really been different ways of kind of reimagining my world and having to tap into a deeper creative practice to do that too. So it's been really interesting.
Yeah. Again, my mind is just exploding with so many things that you offered us there that I really want to tease out and explore. I mean, the collage seems like such an important metaphor to your point. I mean,
Yeah.
folks know who've listened to my show, I sort of offer a shredded manuscript metaphor of like,
Yeah.
that's how I think about grief. And we do feel like our world has been shredded into pieces. And yet part of our work in grief is to move forward. And so how do we bring those pieces from the past with us, those our people, our parts of ourselves, but also turn a gaze towards finding beauty or meaning in life, not in
Yeah.
the loss itself. And also to your point, I think I really want listeners to hear, in case it sort of floated over them, that this particular practice, collage, and it can be lots of different practices, was really a somatic, meaning a way to get into your body, because sometimes we are at a loss, especially in early grief, when our brain is sort of shut down in a state of shock for words. Words
Yeah.
can't really help us access what we're going through. So I love the idea of that you offered us, but that also you practiced as a griever yourself, of physically dropping into trying to work through, not neat and tidy bow 5 stages, but to sort of work through the shredded mess that is our lives in the wake of
Yeah.
loss. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's just so many ways to like somatically drop into art. And one of the things that is so interesting is like, even you asking about what was my art practice when they were, when my parents were dying, which like changed profoundly as my grief changed. And so
Yes.
even early on, like I might have only been able to sit with like a coloring book and just scribble. But that in itself is like a release. It's doing something, you're using your hands in a way. And whether you're thinking about your loss or you're not, like there is just a way to like really kind of start to feel what is in your actual body and start to move that in different ways. And so I always like encourage people, because a lot of people get caught up in like, well, I'm not an artist, or
Yeah.
how am I going to make art? I don't want to put pressure on myself to make art when I'm grieving. And like,
Yeah.
of course, we don't want to put pressure on ourselves
Yeah.
for anything. And so, like that's why I'm starting to create more experiences for people to just be able to drop in.
Yeah.
And the stuff is there and they can just play with it as they want. But also for people to know that the art doesn't have to mean anything. It doesn't have to do anything.
Doesn't
It
have to
doesn't ever have to
resemble
see
something.
the day, the light of day, but it can just be this physical practice of doing something that really starts to kind of change your brain in a way that allows you to kind of drop all the heady stuff that's in your head and just go into what your body is feeling and create kind of safer moments for ourselves to feel these things.
To be with our emotions.
Yeah. So many of us have learned that like being with our emotions is really scary. And not only is it scary for us, but it scares other people.
To your point from the beginning.
Right. So how can we start to create more moments of safety for ourselves so that we can start to feel these things and then we can start to integrate them. And then we are in that place of like moving forward or feeling like empowered with our grief because we know that it's there and it's our buddy and we can somatically drop into it, or we know what these feelings are, or we feel equipped to explore what these feelings are. But we can't do that without like kind of starting to create these micro moments of safety within ourselves.
I'm so glad that you brought up this notion of safety. And also just as a reminder to listeners is that we think our emotions are in our head, but our emotions are actually an embodied experience. And so to tap into them and to allow them to move through, which is really their purpose, right, is to emote, meaning is to move through. We need a sense of safety. And we're in a kind of chronic stress state, especially in early grief, because this thing that happened to us is a signal that we are not safe in the world, right? It might be the loss of a parent, a partner, a friend, or a homeland, a dream, a sense of safety. And I think particularly creativity, and that's why I keep leading with that word versus art, because I think you're right. So many of us get stuck on like, I'm not an artist. I don't know how to produce art, but creativity and play, when enacted in your body, automatically sends a signal to your nervous system that you're safe because you're not going to be like, stopping and running from the saber-toothed tiger on the savannah back in the day. And play, if you're in danger. And so I love that you invite us into that practice. And I want to hear more about, in particular, the community work that you're doing and particularly focusing on the LGBTQ plus community. I wanted to hear a little bit more from you because I think this might be helpful for listeners, particularly listeners who might be walking alongside somebody who is, maybe in the near end stages of life, around the meditative practice of photography. Again, you don't have to be a photographer.
Yeah.
But sort of like, how did you use that to be present to capture the moment? Did you use it as a sort of like grounding or an arriving practice to be present, knowing that someday you want to come back and that you maybe felt out of body because here you were watching someone you love died? But can you tell us a little bit about your own experience or how you think about photography as a meditative practice?
Yeah. So,
or mindfulness maybe?
Yeah.
When we come back, Jamie explains how their memory has suffered as a result of trauma, which, if you didn't know, is a common side effect. It's actually something I experience as well. So, what they discovered is that taking pictures is a way to spark or reconnect with their memory. You're listening to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Kefauver. I wonder if you're looking for more grief resources or access to practices and tools that will help this journey of grief suck less. Or maybe you're just wanting to find more ways to connect with me and my work off the air. If that's the case, I've got just the thing for you. Occasionally, I drop into your inbox with my not-so-regular newsletter to share a bit of wisdom I think you might want to know about. It might be an essay about a topic I've been exploring lately, like the healing power of beauty, wonder, and awe in the wake of loss. Sometimes it's a journal prompt or a guided meditation that will help ease your suffering. Other times it includes news about events I'm hosting or participating in that I think you might like. I often invite you to write me a personal note answering a question I have about how you're moving through grief too. So if that sounds like a free resource you'd like to have, I got you covered. Just head to lisakefauver.com/newsletter to sign up. Although I love being able to reach and support thousands of people each week through this show, my passion is working directly with people navigating grief. A few times a year, I have openings for a 6-session package of individual grief support that is ideal for newly grieving individuals facing all kinds of loss that could be death, but also includes illness, divorce, endings, major life transitions, and more. Or perhaps you're an individual further down the road who's looking for specialized grief care as a supplement to other therapeutic supports. Over our time together, you'll feel held and cared for, have a chance to tap inward to discover your existing skills, discover some of the barriers or shoulds that might be getting in your way. We'll be able to help you cultivate a mindfulness practice essential for easing suffering, identify your emerging needs as a griever, and begin to build the community of support you'll need as you continue on your journey. One client recently shared about our work together. Lisa provides practical advice and insights that apply to the daily challenges that grief presents, but with a heavy dose of self-care and spiritual awareness that provides support when I find myself at my darkest. The combination of real quantitative suggestions and exercises coupled with the spiritual self-care reminders is extraordinarily helpful for me. To learn more and reserve your spot today, after the show, visit lisakefauver.com/support.
Well, it first started, I have to say that part of it is that I have a terrible memory, and that's what trauma does to you,
Yes.
right? Like trauma just like takes your memory and is like, whoop.
Yeah.
And then I also have neurodivergence. So just memory is just generally difficult for me. So taking photographs of things is a way to, spark that memory or bring it back. But it was also, something that I've learned so much in just my work as a photographer was we take photos of what is important to us or what feels impactful in that moment or something that feels beautiful or something that feels interesting. And so I really wanted to be able to remember how important these moments were and to just not forget that this was such a profound sense of time in my life that was filled with terror and rage and like sadness and all these other things and also beauty. It's like that's the part that is so kind of difficult about grief is that and losing someone is that you see both like the ugliest sides of life and also the most profoundly beautiful. Like the ways that people show up for you are like mind blowing. And then also the horrible devastation of the people who don't show up for you and, savoring these quiet, simple moments or like there are a few little moments that I had with my mom at the end of her life that like I will cherish forever. And there were also moments with my mom that like I wish I could forget. And so we're just, it's kind of constantly going back and forth. And so I was just trying to remember the details, And for me, writing them down didn't feel accessible. That felt too like, I don't even know how I feel about this right now. My mind is swirling. I was writing a little bit, but just taking photos. And then I was like, maybe I can figure out what this means to me later. Or maybe it will be something that I decide I don't want a picture of. Or maybe it's something that I'm really, really, truly going to treasure. And so it's always finding that line of being the observer and then also like being present in the moment.
Yeah.
So a lot of it was, how can I preserve this moment? And then also knowing those moments where like, how do I just be in this right here, right now without my camera? And if there's something that I want to remember about this moment, is there something afterwards that I could take a photo of? Or even if it's just my shoes at my mom's bedside, like that is enough to just remember,
be a spark
moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's I think that any tool that anybody uses to kind of sit in that moment and to we are always pushed and pulled in, especially when we're sitting bedside with someone or we know someone we love is dying. We are constantly in this place of being present and then being totally somewhere else, whether we are like dissociating totally, or we have to be snapped back into a different version of reality. And so using photography in this way to kind of capture those little moments of time, those magic moments, or even the really hard ones, just so I can kind of go back and think about do more reflecting on that time, have those things that can jog those memories for me, was really, really helpful.
Thank you so much for exploring that. And I think it's so important what you just said, which is to the degree that we can be really present to what is, which is really hard if we're watching someone we love suffer or go through something. And that innately, and also because of the world, we're either being pulled into the past of rumination and regret and how did we get here, or things we said, or pulled into the future, imagining the day where they're not going to be here and how am I going to live without them, or what am I going to do? And so any tool, and which is normal, I'm not pathologizing that or naming that, but to use a mindfulness practice, or even, just to have the lens of the photographer to say, like, to your point, I know that there might be a day right then, it doesn't feel like you'll ever forget this, but for those of us who have trauma brain, me too, but just anything because of that circumstances, how can I capture that? I think is so important. I took one picture of my daughter's note that she wrote to my husband. He was already in a coma on his bed, and my friend took a picture of him. I couldn't do it. She knew I couldn't see it, but I'm so glad I have it, even though it's hard. But the 8 hours I spent in bed with him after they took him off life support before he died, I didn't have my camera. It was 2011. Did we have cameras on our phones? Right. Probably. I don't know. But I did a version of that, which is I spent those 8 hours memorizing every single freckle on his body and the way his swollen face looked like from the brain surgery. And because I knew, and smelling everything I could smell, because I knew that there would come a day, and it had happened a lot sooner than I wished it had, where I couldn't remember those details anymore. And this isn't to scare people. It's just like the degree to which you can be present by using a creative tool like photography, or even just your present awareness. Do it. I know it's scary, but do it, because you're going to be so glad later on that you were able to be present. Again, if it's a peaceful death or it's in the hospital, not all deaths are created equal. So I just want to name that. Many people listening to this have faced violent losses or tragic losses. And anyways, just to name that practice.
But it offers like a witness almost, like it's almost like I'm witnessing myself and allowing that to, because you feel so kind of alone. And there are all those intricacies of a death that I think a lot of people don't think about, or they don't talk about in grief, that shape someone's grief experience. So, like when people hear, oh, you lost your husband, they think, oh, that's so, that's so sad. That's awful. You must miss him. But they don't think about those 8 hours and what that felt like and how traumatic that must have felt, and also how loving that must have felt, and just all the sights and sounds and things that you have to experience. And so when I was either capturing it as a photographer or even just giving myself, like, I'm going to remember this moment and I'm witnessing myself, because no one else can see this.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to give myself that witnessing and say, like, yeah, it makes a lot of sense that you were feeling horrible or completely out of this world when you were going through that, because here's this evidence, or here's these things that I'm like, even just taking that time to like sit and memorize his face. Like, my mom used to do that with my dad. She would like run her finger down his nose and she'd just be, I'm memorizing his face.
Yes.
And, you're giving yourself that time and that witnessing of like, this is a really profound moment. This is a really important time, even though it's hard, and like, we can be in this.
Yeah. Even though it's hard, we can do hard things, as the saying goes.
Yes.
Thank you so much for walking us through your own practices, and also just remind me of, should we bring your mom and dad into the room? What were their names?
Their names were Jim and Billy. And
Jim and Billy.
Yeah, I'm named after my dad. My dad's name is James.
James.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for bringing Jim and Billy into the room with us, and also your practices. And so you alluded to, clearly you've walked so personally, so many losses, and also the experience of accompanying people sort of at that personal way. Then you have this intersection of this art, both that came sort of from your family, but also a practice that you pursued professionally, personally in your life. Tell us then what has come to be this work of the Queer Grief Club, and the work that you do that's bringing kind of all of those intersections together, including community, which is what we talked about before, and the importance in particular about creating these safe spaces for queer folks. Tell us a little bit about how that came to be, and maybe more importantly, or equally importantly, what does that look like in your day? What have you learned from this work that you've been doing?
So I am just so grateful to be doing this work now, and it has changed my life in a million different ways. And it's always one of those things that someone was like, I think you kind of got initiated into this work, as we all kind of do, because I don't know a single person who works in grief and loss and death and dying who hasn't had some sort of personal experience with it. And a lot of us are going into this and saying, like, I want to create better experiences for people. I want to fill the holes that were there when I was going through it, or I want to provide support for people, that the kind of support that I really needed. And so for me, I wanted to, it's kind of a twofold thing. So in death work, there's so much support that needs to be filled in. A lot of, again, it's like creativity. We have to get creative for how we're going to fill those holes, how we're going to support someone at the end of their life. How can we into different practices or different modalities to keep them comfortable, to really be hand-tailored to who they are and what they have to say and what they want their end-of-life experience to be. And then also knowing that grief is such a unique and interesting thing. And why are we kind of prescribing this one-size-fits-all, thing for grievers, when we know that grief is so different, it's so unique, everybody has different flavors of it, but then there are these threads of connection, which is why being in community with other grievers is so important. And so, it wasn't, again, it was my own personal experience with grief and loss. My partner and I lost a baby in 2020, and in a really tragic and profound way. And when we were starting to look for support groups, especially around pregnancy loss and late pregnancy loss, we were just really astounded by, one, how gendered it was, and two, just how we were always kind of the only queer people in the room. And oftentimes, as someone who I wasn't carrying our baby, I was kind of left out of the equation.
Yeah.
It was sometimes like, husbands are welcome. And I was like, well, I'm not a husband. And when you say things like you're welcome to come, that language kind of
like
implies,
an afterthought.
yeah, like, oh yeah, you can come as kind of a support person. Or so I realized that there were also just so many experiences that we had that were unique to our grief because we were a queer couple. So I started to connect with other people and just, opening my eyes to like how much grief support is needed for the queer community, unique our losses are, and the layers that come with being queer, the intersections of our grief, and how that kind of plays out in our bigger world. And so I wanted to both create more experiences for people where they can kind of process their grief, where they can play with their grief, where they can, explore their grief in a safer container, but that they can also be around other queer people and who understand or who are going to feel similar things or who are just going to want that community. And so it started with just a couple of meetups and then began to bloom into bigger online spaces and then kind of still in-person meetups. And it's been such a beautiful way of seeing that communal grieving is such a beautiful and sacred thing that we can do for each other and for ourselves. And I think a lot of people feel terrified to go into community spaces when they're grieving because we've all had those experiences where we are shut down or our grief is too much, or it just feels kind of stuffy and approachable, or it's kind of that, well, we're still here in the 5 stages of grief, which we all know is like not actually thing. And so a lot of times, even when I was going to grief groups, after my dad died, like I was the youngest person there, I felt really out of place. And so when I'm gathering people together, it's really both kind of, I explain it as we are releasing our grief. We're talking about our grief. We're sharing it with each other, but we're also practicing being in community together. And we're also releasing these ideas and these grief beliefs that we've grown up with, that like our grief is too big, our grief doesn't deserve to be heard, our grief is too different from other people's grief to be in community spaces. And so I'm encouraging people not only to just share their grief, but also in the same way, like, how do you show up for other people? How do you hold space for other people when they're grieving? How can we be better at being uncomfortable? How can we be better at just listening and affirming instead of trying to go, oh, no, like, oh, it's okay. Everything's going to be okay. You're going to feel better soon. It's not going to be this way forever. Time heals, everything, all the things that don't feel helpful to anybody. And so can we just sit in the hurt, in the suck of it all, and just, and just be in it together and know that when we are sharing our voices in this way, we actually feel more connected. And we feel this sense of there's a lightness that happens by the end of the group because people have shared, there's been connections, people have been witnessed. And it's really, really beautiful. And then, of course, there's the activity focused part of it, which is the stuff that I do in person and sometimes online. But that's really, again, where that somatic practicing is happening. And just me wanting to create more spaces where grief gets to exist. And it doesn't just have to be grief support group. Here we are. We're just talking about grief. Like, grief should exist in classrooms and in play areas and in art studios and in movement places. But a lot of people get scared. No, no one wants to go to a yoga class if they're grieving, because what if they start crying and then someone comes over and starts to make a big deal out of it? Yeah, exactly. I have definitely left some exercise classes in tears because, the exercise teacher is like, come on, just smile. no, we got this. And I'm like, no, no,
No, I
no, I
know.
just let me be in the back. Like the story of my life is like, just let me be in the back quietly crying. Come on.
I want to add something to you. I want to hear more about the practices, but I want to just like draw out something you just said, which is like, can't we have places in exercise places and playgrounds and blah, blah, where grief exists? And I think to your point and to the work that I'm doing is grief is existing in all those places. We're just
Exactly.
walking around pretending that they don't, which is
Exactly.
that's where that unnecessary suffering that I talk about so often, I think happens, which is in that gulf between what we actually know to be happening in our embodied selves and what the world is showing or talking about. And I love the kind of container metaphor that you're talking about in these communities is we're not there solving each other's problems because, by the way, grief isn't a problem to be solved, but we're there validating and normalizing, being able to set down the shoulds that we have that are in our stories, seeing ourselves reflected in other people, seeing different experiences reflective in other people. But to me, when we find community, whether it's in organized, beautiful groups like yours, one-on-one with somebody virtually or in person, it's not about solving it. It's about finding a place where people can carry the weight of your grief with you in a way. That's how I think about it. And as you were describing this way of in which you create these groups, that's what it really felt like is, can we carry this weight together for a while?
Yeah, exactly. And then it gives people a little more. I mean, I hope that every chance that we get to have our grief witnessed and held in community or held by other people, it starts to help us be a little more brave in the way that we express our grief out in the world. And when it's not met with kindness and empathy and support, we can start to realize that that's not on us in our grief.
Yeah.
That's on the other people, and that we know that there are people and there are spaces that this grief can exist, and it can be loud and messy and awful and heavy, and it can still be held. And then how do we take, if we're creating these little kind of micro worlds of safety for our grief, how can we start to take that out into our other communities,
Yeah.
into the regular space, into all the spaces where grief does exist? Because we know that like some of the most boring places in the world are the griefiest, the grocery store or
Exactly.
going to the DMV or any of these places. Like, there's so much grief. If you walk into the aisle of wherever in a grocery store, like, there's got to be at least 10 or 15 people in that grocery store that are experiencing grief and loss in a profound way. And
Yeah.
then there's all the micro griefs of all the other things. So I just feel like there's so much now in my world that is pointing me towards like, how can we create a better grief literate and grief accepting and grief holding society? And how can we inspire that sense of kind of courage and self-belief of like, my grief deserves to be heard, it deserves to be shared, and it deserves to have the recognition and the honor that it needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I share that mission with you.
Yeah.
For sure. I wonder in your particular groups, a couple questions are coming to my mind as we wind our way towards the end of our conversation today, but things you've learned as you've offered these groups from the people themselves, from your experiences, but also I think for folks who are listening who are already or who are trying to create or find safe spaces and safe communities wherever they live, whether, hope ideally in person, but online if needed. What do you think are the key ingredients to creating safe spaces? You are particularly focusing on creating safe spaces for folks in the queer community, but I can imagine that those same principles sort of apply no matter what kinds of communities you're creating. So what does safety look like, or what are the ingredients of safety when we think about gathering in grief communities? And just maybe a lesson or two or an aha you've
Yeah.
discovered as you've been doing this work.
Yeah. Something that I feel like is really important to me is just knowing that, one, everyone's sense of safety is really different. So having leaders or having groups that are going to be really accessible to a lot of different people is really important. And so knowing that, like, sometimes I feel like we can put a lot of pressure on ourselves as grievers, even show up to a grief group in a certain and specific type of way.
Yeah.
And so I've really appreciated when there have been other tools or other things in grief groups that allow you to show up imperfectly, or that allow you to kind of participate in ways that feel accessible to you. So like when I have an online group or an in-person, like no one is required to share, and they can, like we can there are lots of different ways that people can share if sharing, audibly doesn't work for them. Having things like, if I'm doing an in-person group, like I oftentimes have like little squeeze balls or fidget spinners or something that they can do with their hands. Having a lot of different options for ways that people can engage with their grief is really great. So I think that that's just expanded, like doing this work has just expanded my mind in just that grief can be everywhere and it can look so different, and the ways that we integrate it, the ways that we work with it can be so different, and that there's really no wrong or right way to do it. It's just as long as you feel like really supported to show up as your full self in that moment. That to me is like that sense of safety. Like I want people to feel like they can show up as their full grieving selves, and that we are all assuming kind of best interest for each other. We're all here. We're all going to be showing up differently. We're all going to have really different grief. And there's no hierarchy here. We're here to just be in community together, and really like establishing those kind of community guidelines at the beginning of just that, like we are really here to hold this grief together. And this is how we do that. I think is really creates such a sense of just letting those walls down a little bit so that you can really show up with a fullness to that space. And I've just learned so much, and by being in these spaces and having them come from a more community centered. So I'm not the expert, I'm not the leader, I'm like holding the container and I'm kind of facilitating things, but there's such special spaces because everyone's really willing and eager to learn from each other and want to know, like, what did you do in this moment? Or how do you spend an anniversary? Like, I don't know what to do on that day. Like, has anyone else had an anniversary thing that they've done that really, feels good? And so there's such a sharing of knowledge. There's such a camaraderie. And it just reminds me again that like grief is really powerful in community, and it can be such an agent for change and for growth and for connection, and it can be so beautiful.
Yeah. I love that notion that you just shared in particular, that it can be so beautiful, because I think, and beautiful doesn't mean happy and laughing and jolly,
Right.
although some of my biggest laughing moments have been in groups of grievers. I'm going to tell you that.
Sure.
Right. And also just to name that when we're in the spaces that feel safe, where we can be the camaraderie or be learning from each other. But also, I think to your point, I just want to reinforce, because I think for me, one of the potential harms in our sort of grief illiterate culture when we gather with people, whether it's a formal in-person talking grief support group, or a family gathering, maybe a gathering, that's a community space gathering, is our propensity to what you named earlier, which is to fix each other, to quiet down someone's raw pain, and to assure and reassure. And it's not that I don't think that there's place and space for reassurance, but I think it's important to first start with pausing and naming and validating. I see you exactly as you are. And that can feel hard for the person doing it, but can feel so beautiful for the person receiving it. And we often don't get that, especially from our family members, because they're the ones who it's the hardest to see us in that deep pain.
Yeah. It's just so uncomfortable for people to see other people in pain. And the more that we can stretch ourselves to our capacities and say like, how can I sit in this discomfort and just affirm this for you?
Yeah.
And just say like this, it makes sense that you feel like your whole world has fallen apart, or I see how much you are hurting. And, grief is truly horrific. And I know you're in it right now. And
Yeah.
like, I'm just sending you so much extra love and care. That makes so much more of a difference than someone, coming in and saying like,
With the
it's okay. It's okay. Like, here, let's go outside. Let's go outside and we'll talk about, like it
distract.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's just a reminder to our hearts that are really in such turmoil that like, yes, this, of course you are feeling this sad, this distraught, this pain, this rage, all of the things. And like, it's okay. It's okay to feel this, because grief is huge. It's humongous.
Yeah.
The biggest thing we will conquer in our lives.
And we shouldn't have to do it alone. Yeah.
No. Yeah. We are built for community, and grief is really needed to be in community.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, my friend, Jamie Thrower. I'm going to drop all of her details, social media and website in the show notes for today's episode. You absolutely need to follow her work. You're in the Portland area. I know you do a lot of things locally, but also you do some things virtually. So even if you're not in the Portland area, you should check. I don't use the word should often, but in this case, yes, you should check out Jamie Thrower's work and jamiethrower.com. But again, she's got an amazing Substack too, Queer Grief Club. So check that out. But again, I'll drop it all in the show notes for today's episode. Jamie, you're an absolute delight.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm just so honored, and we could just talk all day about this kind of stuff. I'm just so grateful for the work that you do, and just for all of us who are out here just making a difference in the grief world, sharing our grief stories and connecting people in that way. It's so needed and important. And this is how we build a better world for us grievers.
Absolutely. Well, I love being in community with you. So thank you so much for joining me on Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast.
Thank you.
Every time I spend time with Jamie, which I've been lucky enough to do in real life a time or two, I learned something new. This conversation was no exception. I hope this conversation helped you feel seen and held in your own grief. Maybe it taught you some new creative skills to show up for yourself in the wake of loss, and perhaps some ideas on how to better show up for others and be a safe space to hold their grief. You can learn more about Jamie and the Queer Grief Club at jamiethrower.com. That's jamiethrower.com. You can also follow their work at Queer Grief Club on Instagram. Now, don't forget to look for video clips of our conversation on social media at Lisa Kefauver, MSW, or watch the unedited video version on my new YouTube channel at Lisa Kefauver, MSW. If you loved our conversation today, if you learned something from it, it would truly mean the world to me if you could do just a few simple things. First, make sure you share the episode with another griever who might just need it too. And if you do it on socials, don't forget to tag me at Lisa Kefauver, MSW, so I can thank you. 2, make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you listen to this one so you don't miss the next episode when it drops. And 3, while you're there, please consider leaving a 5-star rating and writing a review. I want to give special thanks to Giles Smith of Alafia Sounds for the music. Okay, my grieving friends, remember that, yes, grief is a sneaky bitch, but don't worry, I got your back. Until next time, I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding you in my heart.